In the intricate tapestry of fate, there was a young boy named Dennis Baker, whose story began amidst modest yet love-filled circumstances. He was shaped by the delicate care of his mother, Lisa, a woman whose life seemed dedicated entirely to the son she had brought into the world alone. The first 5 years of Dennis's life were woven into a tapestry of memories, created under Lisa's loving gaze. Each day was filled with his mother's gentlest and most affectionate gestures. Lisa Baker was a poem of love and tenderness, her melody permeating every aspect of her life and Dennis's life. She didn't have much to offer in material terms, but what she had was more precious: her time, her love, and her commitment. Unfortunately, this dance of mother and son, so full of laughter and precious moments, was cut short too soon. Lisa passed away, stealing the joy from young Dennis and leaving him alone in a world that had seemed friendlier with her by his side. Throughout the years, a mystery hovered over Dennis's life: the identity of his father. Lisa, on her part, never shed light on this matter. There were no mentions, no stories, and definitely no encounters. Dennis's father was a ghost, an absent figure without a face, voice, or presence. He was a gap in his life, an unsolved enigma that Lisa never tried to unravel. For Dennis, the memories of his mother were all he had to hold on to. Even with the void left by his father's absence, he had Lisa's memories. She had been the sun in his universe, the only constant in a world of uncertainties. And though she was no longer physically present, her love and influence remained alive in Dennis, guiding and supporting him as he navigated life's turbulent waves alone. Fate, an unyielding weaver, spun another turn for young Dennis. He found himself torn from the small bubble of his red brick apartment and thrust into the cold and uncomfortable walls of an orphanage. The place, though filled with children, seemed steeped in deafening silence, a cacophony of muted laughter and stifled hopes. The dynamics within the orphanage were a challenge in themselves. Dennis was thrown into a social arena where physical strength often triumphed over kindness and intelligence. The orphanage was inhabited by older children, bullies who seemed to relish asserting their dominance over the younger ones. Young Dennis was an easy target, a gentle soul amidst hungry lions, and he had to learn to dodge and defend himself, and sometimes fight, despite his peaceful nature. Furthermore, Dennis grappled with a sad truth that seemed to weigh upon all the children in the orphanage like a dark cloud: the bleak prospect of being adopted grew more distant as he grew older. He was on the verge of turning 6, a number that, in the reality of orphanages, seemed to create an invisible barrier between children and potential families. Dennis watched as younger children were chosen, walking out the front door with smiling, happy families, while he remained, increasingly immersed in the shadow of oblivion. However, even in the face of these challenges, Dennis refused to surrender to despair. He still carried his mother's love in his heart, a flame that illuminated the darkness of his situation. Each day, he woke up determined to face the world with bravery, carrying Lisa's legacy within him, a shield against the harshness of the world he now had to confront. One day, a faint light emerged on the horizon of young Dennis. The orphanage world stirred with the arrival of the Clarks, a robust and imposing family. The patriarch, Mr. Clark, with his rigid posture and stern eyes, and the matriarch, Mrs. Clark, with a smile that never reached her eyes, inspected the orphanage as if choosing a piece of furniture. Dennis, called Mrs. Hudson, the orphanage director. "The Clarks would like to meet you." With his heart pounding in his chest, Dennis stood up and walked over to the couple, his mind filled with hope and apprehension. It was on that day that he became a Clark, adopted and taken to a new home that was a world completely different from his own. The Clark's house was actually a vast junkyard, where piles of metal and broken machines punctuated the landscape. They had biological children, arrogant and spoiled boys with their parents' eyes, always gleaming with privileges and indulgence. They were treated like princes, never lifting a finger to work. Dennis, on the other hand, along with two other adoptees, Ellie, a girl with dreamy eyes, and Mason, a boy with a friendly demeanor, were forced to adapt to a life of toil. They were the Clarks' little helpers, a kind expression for the hard labor they had to do every day. "Dennis, Ellie, Mason, it's time to work," Mr. Clark would say every morning, pointing to the mountain of metal that needed sorting. "And don't stop until you're finished." The harsh words and the absence of any form of love or kindness made Dennis's new home feel more like a prison. However, he clung to the small spark of hope, the thread of possibility that this new life gave him, however bleak it seemed. Deep down, he hoped that things could change, that somehow he could find a glimmer of light even in the Clarks' junkyard. Often, the sound of laughter and excited planning would fill the Clarks' house, cruelly echoing in the ears of Dennis, Ellie, and Mason. It was the signal that the Clark family was about to go out for dinner at some fancy restaurant in the city, a luxury only the biological children could enjoy. "Mason, Ellie, Dennis," Mrs. Clark would say, a frozen smile on her face as she slid her hand across the table, where 3 cans of canned food were lined up. "Here's your dinner. Remember to clean everything up afterward." While the Clarks' biological children dressed in their finest clothes and went out with their parents, Dennis, Ellie, and Mason sat around the table, opening their dinner cans. The sound of the can being opened was a bitter reminder of the gap between them and the Clarks' biological children. And it wasn't just the outings for dinner. Holidays, which should have been a time of togetherness and fun for the whole family, became a source of more work for the adopted children. While the Clarks and their biological children packed their bags and left for some exotic destination, the adopted children were left behind, working even harder in the junkyard. "We'll be gone for a week," Mr. Clark would say, his cold gaze fixed on the 3 of them. "We expect the work to be done when we return." The moments of leisure for the Clark family were moments of solitude and toil for Dennis, Ellie, and Mason. Every laugh, every outing, and every trip only highlighted the distance between them and the biological children, a constant reminder that they were different, that they were less in the eyes of the Clarks. On the eve of his 16th birthday, Dennis found himself sitting in his small room, looking at the jar of coins and folded bills he had saved over the years. Every penny represented a task completed, a service rendered to a neighbor, a piece of his time and energy exchanged for meager compensation. The sounds of the Clarks' house on a Saturday night reached him, distant laughter and music, sounds of joy and celebration, oblivious to the turmoil within Dennis. He stood up and grabbed the backpack he had prepared, feeling the weight of what he was about to do. "Dennis, what are you doing?" Ellie asked, her curious gaze illuminated by the dim light of the bedside lamp. "I'm leaving, Ellie," Dennis said, keeping his voice steady. "I can't live like this anymore. I can't live as a stranger in my own home." Ellie looked at him, her eyes filling with sadness and understanding. She nodded, a silent gesture of solidarity, and hugged him tightly. And so, under the cover of night, Dennis walked out the back door, carrying nothing but his backpack and the hopes and dreams he had suppressed for years. He didn't have a clear destination in mind, just the vague idea of reaching some distant place, somewhere he could start anew, somewhere like Nebraska. And thus, with determination burning in his chest and the promise of freedom within his reach, Dennis embarked on his journey away from the life he had known, away from the oppression and exploitation of the Clarks, in search of a future he could still call his own. Finding himself in Nebraska, Dennis managed to secure a modest means of subsistence. Life on the streets was a brutal challenge, but the boy found refuge in a hidden corner of the city's central station, where he set up a small shoeshine operation. Through cold mornings and scorching afternoons, Dennis worked diligently, scrubbing and polishing the worn-out, dirty shoes of travelers. Each pair of shoes that crossed his path told a different story, a memory of his former home, a glimpse of a world beyond the streets of Nebraska. Despite the biting cold that made him shiver at night and the constant feeling of hunger gnawing at his stomach, Dennis found in his new life a sense of freedom he had never experienced with the Clarks. Yes, life was hard, reality was harsh, and the daily struggle for survival was draining, but to him, it was still a step above the torment he had left behind. In the streets of Nebraska, Dennis discovered a kind of bittersweet solitude. The city never slept, and even in the darkest hours, there was a constant rhythm, an incessant pulsing of life. Survival was a constant struggle, but it was a struggle he was willing to face because each day brought with it the sweet reminder that he was free from the Clarks and their oppression. Therefore, although his existence was marked by difficulties and challenges, each dawn in Nebraska brought with it a renewal of Dennis's determination, a reminder that his current situation, however bleak, was still preferable to the life he had left behind. On a Tuesday afternoon, while Dennis tirelessly worked at the station, an imposing figure approached. An elderly man, dressed in a well-tailored suit of high-quality fabric and a pair of shiny leather shoes, stood before him. His presence seemed to illuminate the space around him. This was Charles. "Good afternoon, young man," Charles said, his voice deep and gentle at the same time. His eyes met Dennis's, and something sparked there, a familiarity that made Dennis's heart beat a little faster. The appearance of the elderly man struck Dennis like lightning. There was something about him that reminded Dennis of someone he felt he should know, although he knew he had never seen Charles before. It was as if there was a distant echo, a sense of déjà vu, that troubled his mind. At the same time, Charles seemed shocked as he looked at Dennis. His blue eyes widened for a moment, and he paused, observing Dennis as if he were seeing a ghost, as if he were looking at the past. "You remind me of someone I knew a long time ago," Charles murmured, the expression on his face shifting from surprise to deep introspection. "Someone very dear to me." The resemblance and Charles's reaction to him only deepened the mystery surrounding this encounter. And as Dennis rubbed and polished Charles's shoes, he couldn't help but wonder who this man was and why he seemed so strangely familiar to him. From that day on, Charles became a regular visitor to the station, always stopping for Dennis to shine his shoes. As the weeks passed, an unexpected bond began to form between the shoe shiner and the well-dressed elderly man. Each visit from Charles brought with it a new conversation, a new revelation, a new chance to get to know each other better. "Dennis, you remind me so much of someone I knew a long time ago," Charles mentioned during one of his visits, his eyes lost in distant memories. Dennis simply nodded, absorbing every piece of the man's story, who, in turn, opened up to him. Every detail that emerged during their conversations became a new topic to explore, a new path to follow. Dennis, in turn, began to share his own story, speaking of his mother, the Clarks, and his life on the streets of Nebraska. Charles listened attentively, each of Dennis's stories, each revealed detail, only serving to deepen the connection that was forming between them. "And what about you, Charles?" Dennis asked once. "Did you ever have a family?" Charles smiled, a gentle and sad expression taking over his face. "Yes," he said, "once, a long time ago." The friendship between them grew with each interaction, each shared story, and each exchanged laugh. Charles became more than just a client to Dennis, he became a friend, someone who understood his struggles and offered compassionate listening. And for Dennis, that meant the world. He was no longer alone, he had someone to trust, someone who saw him for who he was, a young man with dreams, determination, and a heart full of hope. One day, Charles showed up at the station not alone, but in the company of a younger man, his son, David. David, unlike his father, seemed to always be in a hurry, restlessness pulsating from him like an electric current. He was a man in his 40s, with an air of urgency surrounding him like a cloud. "David, why don't you sit down and let Dennis shine your shoes?" Charles suggested, a note of insistence in his voice. Charles's tone clearly conveyed that the suggestion was more of an order than a request. David furrowed his brow, casting a hesitant glance at the shoeshiner. "Dad, I'm running late, I don't have time for—" He started to protest, but a look from his father silenced any objection he might have had. "Please, David," Charles insisted with a sharp gaze. "This is important." Reluctantly, David sat down, and as Dennis began to work on his shoes, something remarkable happened. The resemblance between David and Dennis was undeniable, the same facial structure, the same eye color, the same shape of the mouth. It was as if they were looking at each other in a mirror. The striking similarity left Dennis speechless. He could feel a connection, a familiarity, between him, Charles, and David. It was an unsettling sensation, as if he were on the verge of a revelation, but he couldn't quite put his finger on what it was. Nevertheless, the connection was there, pulsating like an invisible heartbeat, a mysterious bond between him and this unfamiliar family. David, who had been silently observing the interaction between his father and Dennis, felt an irresistible impulse. He had to ask a burning question that was inside him. "Dennis," he began, his piercing eyes focused on the young shoeshiner. "Could you tell me more about your mother?" Dennis furrowed his brow, a little surprised, but agreed. "Her name was Lisa Baker," he said, sadness tingling his words. "She passed away when I was 5 years old." Upon hearing that name, David visibly recoiled, as if someone had poured a bucket of cold water on him. His eyes widened, and he swallowed hard, a look of disbelief tinged with something more, shock, perhaps, crossed his face. "Lisa Baker," he repeated, as if making sure he heard correctly. I met a Lisa Baker many years ago, during a vacation trip." Dennis looked at him, surprised. "You knew my mother?" David nodded, consternation still painted on his face. "Yes. She was a wonderful woman. I never thought I could have a child with her," he confessed, his voice trembling slightly. The revelation was a shock to Dennis. David, the stranger who seemed so familiar, was a successful man, a wealthy businessman who owned a chain of gas stations. How could this man have a connection to his mother, Lisa? "But, why did she never tell me about you?" Dennis asked, his confusion clearly visible on his face. David shrugged, a look of regret passing through his eyes. "I don't know, Dennis," he admitted, his voice low. "I really don't know." Having absorbed the revelations, David pondered for a moment. He studied Dennis with a newfound appreciation, looking at the young man who could be his son. "Dennis," he began, his voice low and serious. "I think we need to clarify this once and for all. We should do a DNA test." Dennis looked at him, surprised but nodded. He wanted to know the truth as much as David did. The time that followed seemed to drag on. Days turned into weeks as they anxiously awaited the results of the DNA test. The possibility of David being his father was both frightening and exciting for Dennis. Finally, the day arrived. David opened the envelope containing the results, his heart pounding in his chest. He looked at the paper for a moment before looking at Dennis. "It's positive, Dennis," he said, his voice trembling slightly. "I am your father." Dennis absorbed the information, a strange sense of relief and confusion settling in him. David was his father. The wealthy and successful man he had known as a client was his father. David remained silent for a moment, reflecting. "I imagine that Lisa, when she found out she was pregnant, must have thought I would force her to terminate the pregnancy. I was very immature back then." He sighed, running his hand through his hair. "But I can't express how happy I am now. Happy that you are my son, Dennis." Dennis blinked at David, processing the magnitude of the revelation. His world seemed to have turned upside down in a matter of seconds. You're my father?" he asked, his voice almost a whisper. David nodded, his eyes meeting Dennis with newfound tenderness. "Yes, Dennis. I am your father." A flood of emotions swept over Dennis. Shock and disbelief competed with a sense of unexpected relief and happiness. Anger simmered just below the surface, indignation at having been kept in the dark for so long. But above all, he felt hope. A bright hope that filled his heart and washed away the bitterness of the previous years. Now he had a family, a real family. Not the Clarks, who had exploited and belittled him, but a family that could offer him the love and opportunities he had longed for. David, in turn, felt a wave of happiness he hadn't known in years. His life had been consumed by work, filled with long hours at the office and an empty home to return to. His marriage had ended in a childless divorce, and he had thrown himself even more into work. But now, with Dennis, he felt as if he had received a sign from the universe, a reminder to slow down and appreciate life. "Dennis," said David, smiling at the young man before him. "I know this is a lot to process. But I want you to know. I am so happy to have you in my life." Dennis smiled back, his hope shining in his eyes. "I am too, David," he replied. "I am happy too." David, with an overwhelming sense of remorse for the lost time, made a decision. He would not dwell on the past. Instead, he would do everything in his power to make up for the years he had not been present in Dennis' life. "Dennis," he said, looking at his son with determination in his eyes. "I want you to come live with me. I know I can't replace all the years I missed, but I can provide you with a better future." Dennis, surprised but excited, nodded. "I would love to, David." Thus, David officially took on the role of Dennis' father, taking him to live in his luxurious mansion. He provided Dennis with all the life opportunities a wealthy father could offer a son: quality education, enriching hobbies, trips around the world. And there was Charles, the kind old man who set off the chain of events that led to the discovery of the bond between Dennis and David. Charles, married to Anita, was Dennis' grandfather. Dennis not only gained a father but also a pair of grandparents who were more than happy to welcome him into their family. "Look, Dennis," Charles said one day, wrapping an arm around Dennis' shoulders. "I know life hasn't been easy for you. But we're here for you now. Anita and I are so happy to have you in our family." Anita nodded, smiling warmly at Dennis. "We are, dear. Welcome to the family." And so, from despair and loneliness, Dennis found a loving family and a promising future. The story, however, did not end with Dennis' adoption. Upon hearing about the inhumane treatment Dennis, Ellie, and Mason had endured under the care of the Clarks, David was consumed by righteous anger. "Dennis, Ellie, and Mason are not work machines, they are children," David exclaimed one day, slamming his fist on the table in his office. "They deserve love, care, a family." Using his power and influence in society, David ensured that the Clarks faced justice for their crimes. He hired the best lawyers, pressured the local authorities, and did everything in his power to ensure the Clarks were brought to trial. It didn't take long for the Clarks to be convicted of child abuse and exploitation. But David didn't stop there. Knowing that Ellie and Mason were still vulnerable, he made another decision that would further change lives. "I've already been able to offer Dennis a new life, a fresh start," he said to his lawyer. "And now, I want to do the same for Ellie and Mason." In this way, David adopted Ellie and Mason, bringing them into his home. He promised them that they would never have to suffer again, that they would never be exploited. They were now part of a family that loved and valued them, a place where they could finally be children again. "And Ellie, Mason," David said, with a gleam in his eyes, "welcome to the family. Here, you will always be loved and protected." And so, David not only saved one life but three, turning his home into a sanctuary for children who had experienced the worst side of the world. Finally, justice prevailed. The Clarks were brought to face the law, their reign of cruelty and exploitation exposed under the watchful gaze of the public. Convicted for their despicable actions, they were forced to answer for their crimes. Dennis, Ellie, and Mason stood side by side in the courtroom, their hearts pulsing with the sweet sensation of victory. Their eyes gleamed with relief and determination. The fight had been long, but the reward, indescribably gratifying. Finally, justice, Dennis murmured, a smile of relief forming on his lips. Despite all the pain and suffering he had endured, Dennis found what he had always longed for, a true family, a legacy to be proud of, and a future filled with promises. Alongside David, Charles, and Anita, Dennis felt loved, valued. They not only provided him with a home but also the chance to rebuild his life. Not all stories end well, but for Dennis, his story was a testament to resilience, overcoming adversity, and justice. Even though the path had been challenging, he could now face the future with a renewed sense of hope and determination. "I have found the truth, and I have gained my freedom," Dennis said at a family dinner. The table applauded in unison, their laughter and smiles filling the room with warmth and happiness. "This is my story, and I wouldn't change a thing about it," Dennis concluded, raising his glass in a toast. "Here's to the future and all the possibilities that await us." Dennis' legacy was one of bravery and truth. His journey, though filled with hardships, had shaped him into the man he was now, strong, fair, and hopeful for the future. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to leave a like and share this video. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any of our touching stories. Until next time.